Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historian-splaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. Also, for any non-patrons, I'll link to the video that I recently completed and posted on Patreon and on YouTube, which is the latest in my series analyzing the recent movie, Red, White, and Royal Blue. And if you become a patron at any level, even if it's just $1, you can view that whole video without ads. But this lecture will be The History of the United States in 100 Objects, Part 23, the Touro Synagogue Torah Finials. And this lecture will be brought to you by the letter W. So just to begin with the basics, what are these two objects? They are a pair of so-called Torah Finials, or rimonim as they're called in Hebrew, meant to be affixed to the tops of the two staves or rollers of the Torah scroll in a synagogue. Each of these pair is 14.5 inches tall, made of silver and brass, worked into 3 stacked decorated bulbs, surmounted on top by a crown and a pine cone or pineapple figure, and affixed with 18 small silver-gilt bells suspended from brackets. They were made in New York by the silversmith Myers between 1766 and 75. They are owned by the Jewish congregation Shearit Israel in New York City, and are currently displayed in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So this pair of rimonim, or Torah Finials, is rather famous, or one might even say notorious. For one thing, for who made them. They are arguably the great masterpiece of the silversmith Myers, the only Jewish artisan known to have worked in precious metals in colonial America, and also for the question of who does or does not own them. They've been the object of a bitter legal dispute, which has continuing spillover ramifications right up to today. So in this lecture, I'll try to cover what these two finials are, who made them, what they represent religiously and artistically, how they ended up in a museum in Boston, and why they have been the object of bitter contention. So what are Torah Finials, or rimonim, to begin with? They are decorative objects meant to decorate the tops of the scroll rollers when the Torah is not being used. In Hebrew, as I mentioned, they are called rimonim, meaning pomegranates, partly due to their round shape. They are sometimes very elaborate. In Jewish tradition, in a synagogue, the most holy object is the Torah scroll, which must be laboriously handwritten on special parchment. When it is not being read, it is rolled and covered in a cloth mantle and kept in a large cabinet called the Aron Kodesh, or Holy Ark. During a Torah worship service, the Torah is brought out from the Ark and is sometimes paraded around the synagogue before it is then brought to a reading desk on the bimah, or raised platform, where it can be uncovered and unrolled to a passage to be read. The Torah scroll can only have plain Hebrew text with no embellishments, but the cloth mantle and the rollers may have decorations. The mantle is often richly embroidered, and at least since the 11th century, many synagogues in the Middle East and the Balkans decorated the rollers with crowns to go on the top end, which can then be removed and put aside when the Torah is unrolled to be read. In the 12th century, these crowns on top of the staves were enlarged into more elaborate finials, called, as we said, rimonim, which are then also affixed with bells, which then ring out when the Torah comes out of the Ark and travels to the reading desk. And this style of ornamentation became traditional all over Europe in the Middle East in the later Middle Ages and Renaissance era. Now, as for these particular rimonim, they are one of 5 known pairs made in colonial North America, all of them by the master silversmith Myers. So who was he? Well, he was born in 1723 in New York, which was the British colony that offered the greatest legal pathway for Jews to naturalize, gain full political rights, and the right to practice a trade. His parents were Solomon and Judith Myers, who migrated to New York from the Netherlands. Fairly little is known about them, but it seems that they were from an Ashkenazi background, and the name Myers is Germanic. Also in 1723, the father, Solomon, was naturalized as a freeman and hence as a British subject in New York. His occupation was listed as a shopkeeper, and he also served in minor managerial roles for Shearit Israel, the Jewish congregation in New York, which dated back to the Dutch colonial period, and specifically to 1654, when the Dutch government allowed a group of Jews who had been expelled from Brazil to resettle in New Amsterdam. And the congregation persisted into the 18th century and still exists to this day. And in that time, in the colonial period, the congregation was mainly Sephardic, so Jews deriving from Spanish and Portuguese backgrounds, but there were some Ashkenazim as well, including among them the Myers family. Solomon and Judith Myers had 7 children. The eldest son was Myer Myers, named reportedly after his paternal grandfather. And this seems to be how our silversmith ended up with this sort of odd double name. It is uncertain where he was educated, but most likely he attended the small school of the Shearit Israel Synagogue, which taught Jewish children English, Dutch, Spanish, and Hebrew. In 1740, the father, Solomon Myers, died, leaving his wife Judith with 7 children, the eldest of whom was Myer, aged only 17. And they received a stipend from Shearit Israel, but naturally they still needed further income. So in 1746, when Myer was aged 23, he also became a freeman of New York, and hence a full-fledged citizen of the town with the right to vote and practice a trade. And his profession was listed as goldsmith. And shortly thereafter, he set up his own shop on Wall Street in Lower Manhattan, working mainly in silver. Now, this fact of his occupation is surprising because metalworking in precious metals was the highest status craft profession in that era, and there had never been a professional Jewish silversmith in America before. And one has to ask, who would have trained a young Jew in this rarefied trade and accept him into the guild or association of precious metal workers? And in this time, most Jews in America had come from Western Europe and the Mediterranean, and Jewish gold and silversmiths were practically unknown in that entire part of the world and were not allowed into the goldsmiths' guilds. And hence, Jewish communities tended to rely on Gentile craftsmen for their needs for ritual objects and artworks. But the situation was different in Eastern Europe. The guilds had less power there, and the Jewish communities also were more self-sufficient. And so there was a tradition in Eastern Europe of silversmithing among Jewish communities, especially for ritual objects for the home or the synagogue, such as Kiddush cups, menorahs, and spice boxes. And perhaps it's possible that the Myers family might have been connected to this Ashkenazi tradition. And it happens that one of Myers' younger brothers, named Asher, became a successful brazier or brass worker, which further suggests that possibly metalworking ran in the family. Still, as for who trained him, there's no known record of his apprenticeship, but based on his early styles and techniques, craft historians think that it was probably Charles Leroux, a silversmith of French Huguenot extraction in New York. And the style of Myer Myers' early works in basically the 1740s and 50s was a simple and understated Baroque, basically neoclassical, involving elegant tapering forms and understated ornamentation, in keeping with the plain neoclassical style of that time, inspired, for instance, by the excavations at Pompeii. In 1753, Myer Myers married Elkala Cohen, and they went on to have 5 children. And over the course of the 1750s, his business did quite well, especially with the growth of New York and the influx of wealth that came with the 7 Years' War, as Britain used New York as a command base and port for moving ships, soldiers, officers, weapons, etc. from Britain to the war front. Still, nonetheless, Myer Myers' patronage network was probably quite limited, including by the fact that he was a Jew and was not related or connected to the major wealthy merchant houses or churches of New York. In 1756, he formed a business partnership with a Gentile silversmith named Benjamin Halstead, and this was the first known business partnership between two non-kin related smiths in New York, and it probably served as a way for Myers to make up for his lack of kin network. But also over the years, especially the late 1750s, Myers gained more notoriety of his own through his skill and artistry, and he drew on his own links of religion and gained patronage, for one thing, from Shearit Israel, and also from other Jewish congregations in the colonies, including Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. He also served as a leader in the congregation Shearit Israel in New York, including serving for a year as president in 1759. So he'd become a prominent leader of the Jewish community. But still, his heyday in terms of success and productivity really began in the early 1760s, when he was known for making very high-value items, including finely finished teapots, coffee pots, candlesticks, and snuffers, etc. And he adopted a more elaborate Rococo style. So this is an artistic style that began in France and Germany in the early 1700s and then came into fashion in the colonies after about 1760 or so. So Myers was sort of a pioneer of bringing this new aesthetic into America. And it involves richer ornamentation and organic, naturalistic curving forms. And the style really began from architecture, where interior spaces, private spaces, were designed to evoke grottos, sort of natural rock outcroppings, which were popular as garden retreats. And the style uses intricate decoration involving vine work and fretwork against flat backgrounds. And Myers excelled in the Rococo style, arguably was really the master of American Rococo. And he used patterns of foliage, scroll work, and shells, perhaps evocative of the woods, marshes, and coves on the Atlantic coast. In 1765, his wife Alcala died, and in 1766, he dissolved his partnership with Halstead. But the following year, in 1767, he remarried to Joyce Mears, with whom he had 8 more children, some of whom died in early childhood. In the late 1760s to early 1770s, it seems his business model and strategy changed. And this became his heyday just in terms of scale of productivity. He assembled together a large team of skilled assistant craftsmen, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, but they produced generally smaller and more simplified forms, producing in bulk, it seems, for a wider market, probably taking advantage of the lack of cheaply made imports from Britain because of the boycotts on British goods during the imperial crisis. And his finely made objects at this point were more rare, but he did still make some of them for private wealthy patrons and others for Jewish ceremonial uses. And he, it seems, pursued different techniques to achieve Rococo decorative effects. So less sculptural ornament and more use of ajouré, which is a term for pierced work, or the art of punching through flat surfaces, leaving behind faux lattice work patterns, giving the illusion of three-dimensional woven forms or of living, moving forms like vines or vessels of a body. And his Torah rimonim, 5 pairs of them in all, seem to date from this period. And this particular pair we're talking about, which is linked to Touro Synagogue, was made probably about 1770 to 72. And this pair is especially artistically and religiously significant. It's very different from the familiar forms that had been seen in synagogues in Western Europe and the American colonies, and which were made usually by Western European smiths. And these use architectural forms, especially towers and fortresses, perhaps evoking the idea of God as a king and defender, and placing the small bells within little window frames in the architectural forms. But Myers' rimonim instead are based around abstract bulbous forms with punchwork and chasing to create the illusion of entwining vines, and in the case of this specific pair, pomegranate vines. And these sorts of round forms and vine work are more common in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And again, Myers came from an Ashkenazi ancestry, so perhaps the style of these rimonim reflects his affinity for more Eastern European forms. But also there is a theological significance to them in the revival of the emphasis on the pomegranate, which in Judaism is traditionally a symbol of life and abundance. The hundreds of seeds within the pomegranate have been said to represent the 613 mitzvot, or divine commandments in the Torah. And the pomegranate is also associated with the temple. So according to descriptions, the front gate of the temple was flanked by 2 pillars entwined with pomegranate vines, which symbolize the tree of life from the Garden of Eden. And furthermore, the 2 staves of the Torah scroll are traditionally called Etzei Chaim, meaning trees of life. So the use of the pomegranate and other vegetation motifs reflects a return to ideas centering on regeneration and eternal life. And in keeping with this, each of these finials has 18 bells affixed to it. And the number 18 evokes also the theme of life. So in the Jewish tradition of Kabbalah, each word is believed to translate into a number based on the sequence of letters in the word. And the numerical value corresponding to the word chai, meaning life or living, is 18. And hence 18 is traditionally held to represent life, regeneration, and good fortune, much like the pomegranate. So the design of these finials reflects this belief and also the renewed interest in the temple in this period, which was growing especially in the American colonies in the 1700s. And that interest is seen also in the designs of synagogues built in the colonies in the 18th century, which often used the dimensions and forms such as an elevated open women's gallery supported by 12 pillars that are based on descriptions of Solomon's temple. One example of this is Touro Synagogue, built in 1763 for Congregation Jeshuat Israel in Newport, Rhode Island. And further, themes relating to the temple, the millennium, and anticipation of the Messiah are also seen in Jewish artworks like gravestones from this same time period in the late 1700s. And it seems that this was connected to the furor over the imperial crisis in the British Empire, which led up to the revolution, and which some, including colonial Jews, saw as a sign of the coming millennium. So in this way, the political upheaval of that time may have also been partly an inspiration for the design of these Torah Finials. But also, this same political crisis would lead to a rupture in Myer's career. So in 1776, British forces landed in New York, and Americans, as they fled, set fire to the city, and much of New York was destroyed before it was then occupied. Myers fled from New York to Norwalk, Connecticut, and when Norwalk also was burned in a British raid, he then fled further east to Stratford, Connecticut. He evidently set up shop there for a time and made small silver goods like spoons and tankards. Finally, he relocated to Philadelphia for the last few years of the war and made bullets for the American army. In 1783, the British finally withdrew from New York, and Myers returned. He helped to reorganize and reincorporate Shi'arite Israel, but he could not set up his business as before. At this point, he's over 60 years old. Both colleagues and patrons have been scattered by the war, and there's an economic depression in the mid-1780s. But nonetheless, it seems he made at least a few more silver pieces before finally retiring. In 1786, he served as the president of the Silversmith Society in New York, and he died in 1795. So that is the basic story of Myers. How and why were these particular Torah Finials in Newport? Well, it seems that these rimonim most likely were made for the Jewish congregation in Newport. And Newport at this time was a thriving commercial town in the years just before the Revolution. So in the mid-1700s, the town experienced a boom from trade with the West Indies. And this was in large part supplying fish, grain, horses, and other goods to the West Indian colonies in return for sugar and molasses, which was then distilled into rum in distilleries around Rhode Island. And also increasingly at this time, the wealthiest merchants in Newport were launching slaving voyages all the way to West Africa to procure captives from the slave-trading fortresses, which they then brought through the Middle Passage back to the West Indies and North America and sold as slaves. And finally, like New York, Newport also benefited from being used as a British base for the outfitting of military operations in the 7 Years' War. So during this time, Newport also had a Jewish group called Congregation Jeshuat Israel, which, like Shearit Israel, also dated back to the 1600s, and also comprised mostly Sephardic Jews with some Ashkenazim as well. In the 1760s, this group was still small but growing. There were Jews migrating in from other colonies, and also crypto-Jews from Portugal, who were fleeing from the Inquisition and from the 1755 earthquake that destroyed most of Lisbon. And many of these crypto-Jews relocated to Newport to take advantage of the religious freedom in Rhode Island and openly re-embraced Judaism, where they had to keep their Jewish loyalties secret in Portugal. The Jews in Newport were mainly shopkeepers, artisans, or minor merchants who managed trade in wine from Portugal and provisions to the West Indies. But also at least two Jewish merchants, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera and Aaron Lopez, made their fortunes from slave trading. So most of the slave traders in Newport were Gentiles, especially Anglicans and Quakers, but in many ways the whole economy of Newport was buoyed by profits from the slave trade, and again, a small number of the wealthiest Jewish merchants did also get directly involved in slaving voyages. And in this way, the behavior of these Jewish colonists was basically the same as their Gentile neighbors. Over the course of the early 1760s, when it seemed as if the town was really booming and the congregation was growing and prospering, they gathered donations from members and also from other Jewish communities in other colonies for a fund to build a synagogue. And they commissioned the renowned architect Peter Harrison to design it. And he also, again, used dimensions and motifs inspired by Solomon's Temple and borrowed from other Solomonic-style synagogues in other places like Barbados and Amsterdam. In 1763, the synagogue was completed and it was dedicated on the first night of Hanukkah. And it happens that the synagogue building still stands and is today the oldest synagogue building in the United States and the only one surviving from before the Revolution. For a time in the 1760s to 70s, the synagogue thrived, it was elegantly decorated, and employed a chazan, or professional cantor and Torah lector, named Isaac Touro, and hence the building came to be called the Touro Synagogue. And it seems that this particular pair of rimonim were made for the Touro Synagogue in Newport, since they were housed and used there as of the end of the 18th century. However, it is unknown exactly how they got there. The Newport group at this point did not have all that much wealth and actually was in debt from the building project, which had absorbed their funds. And they probably could not have afforded commissioning very fine silverwork like this pair of finials. But perhaps they might have been gifted by another Jewish group or by a rich benefactor like Aaron Lopez. But there is no known surviving record of this gift or sale. And we know this because the ownership of the finials later became the object of a legal dispute, and both sides searched through the surviving records, and if there was anything left to be found, they probably would have found it. There is one possible clue, which is an inscription on the base of one of the finials saying Hayes and Myers. So Hayes, Hays, and Myers, Myers. It is not certain exactly what this inscription means, who it refers to, or when it was added on. Myers might refer to the silversmith who made the finials, but he did not have a business partner named Hayes. However, there was a Jewish family named Hayes in both New York and Newport in the late 1700s. It's possible that perhaps they commissioned or donated the rimonim. And specifically, Myers did have a close personal associate named Moses Michael Hayes. He was a watchmaker and merchant from New York who was a member of Shearit Israel, like Myers, and he had a further double personal link to Myers. For one thing, he was his brother-in-law. In 1766, Moses Michael Hayes married Myers' sister, Rachel. He also was his lodge brother. They were both Freemasons, and in 1769, the Modern Masonic Grand Lodge of New York granted a charter to a lodge within New York called King David's Lodge. And the leaders of this lodge recorded in this warrant were all Jewish. including the worshipful master, who was Moses Michael Hayes, and beside him as senior warden, Myer Myers. So there is a very dense network of connections between Myers and Hayes. In 1770, Moses Michael Hayes and his business partner Meyer Pollock suffered a series of failed ventures. And in 1771, they relocated to Newport, mainly to take advantage of Rhode Island's fairly generous bankruptcy laws and to begin rebuilding their careers. So Hayes, after this point, became a link and a go-between for the Jewish groups in New York and Newport. So could the inscription on this finial, Hayes and Myers, could it be referring to him, perhaps as the donor? Well, this is possible in principle, but again, in the early 1770s, Hayes certainly didn't have the extra money to pay for such a luxury item. He was still recovering from bankruptcy. And so some theorize that the inscription may have been added on years later to mark the occasion of a wedding between members of the two families, Hayes and Myers. Although I personally don't see exactly how that works or why an inscription like that would be put on a pair of Torah Finials. This is not exactly a typical wedding gift. But anyway, regardless, Newport became bitterly divided during the later part of the imperial crisis in the 1770s, and it was devastated in the Revolution. Newport was raided and then occupied by the British from December 1776 until October 1779. And during these years, the port was blockaded, and they did not have an adequate supply of fuel or firewood from the small island, Aquidneck Island, where the town is located. So they ran out of supplies. Much of the town was looted or torched in the fighting. The outer parts of the town were generally abandoned. Almost half of the population fled, including most of the Jews of Newport. And that includes the Chazan, Isaac Touro, who left for Jamaica. The synagogue remarkably remained standing, even as many other buildings were torched or dismantled for firewood. And it seems it was because the British used it as a field hospital. After the revolution was over, some congregants did return to Newport, and services in the synagogue were revived for a time, with lay members leading the worship. But still, Newport in general was devastated, and its commerce never fully recovered from the damage of the Revolution, followed then by the abolition of the slave trade, which took away one of their main industries, and also from being overtaken by Providence, the other town in Rhode Island, which had greater access to the interior of the continent and better terrain for water mills, which drove early industry. So the small Jewish group in Newport continued to dwindle, and many, it seems, left for New York, where they could get access to kosher food and could be ensured a proper Jewish burial, and so on. Reportedly, in 1822, the last remaining Jew in the town, named Moses Levy, left for New York. So around this time, two members of the Touro family left a fund of money to the state of Rhode Island to maintain the synagogue building, now that there was nobody worshiping there. But the synagogue was simply closed up, and the keys were given over to Shearet Israel in New York to serve as trustees of the property and of all the Jewish ritual objects and furniture therein. For about 30 years, there was no Jewish community that could even muster a minyan in or around Newport, and the building remained locked up and unused, and the ritual objects were stowed away in New York. But in the mid-1800s, the situation began to change. Newport grew as a naval base, and nearby towns like Bristol grew from industry. There was migration from Central and Eastern Europe, including of Ashkenazi Jews, especially from Poland, Germany, and Russia. Shearet Israel, the congregation in New York, occasionally allowed the Touro synagogue building to be unlocked and used for Jewish worship on occasions like the high holidays. Then in the 1880s, two Jewish congregations formed on Aquidneck Island, where Newport is located. One of them was mostly German and called itself Jeshuat Israel, so taking up the name of that earlier, now defunct, colonial congregation. And this group, it seems, was very small and sometimes struggled to form a minyan. But Shearet Israel gave them access to the synagogue. Another congregation, mainly Russian and Polish, was larger, and it called itself the Touro congregation, even though they were not allowed to use the building in Newport. and it seems they resented the favorable treatment extended to the smaller, mostly German group, and they argued that they ought to have use of the synagogue as the largest congregation on the island. And finally, on Passover 1902, members of the Touro congregation broke into the synagogue and began holding prayers. They then fought off police who tried to expel them and held continuous prayers for days so that they couldn't be kicked out of the building. Now, the dispute over control of the synagogue, it seems, went to court. And in 1903, a federal court ruled that Shearit Israel in New York were the rightful owners of the building. But subsequently, Shearit Israel waded into the feuding congregational politics in Newport, brokered the merger of the two Jewish groups into one congregation under the name Jeshuat Israel, and signed a 5-year lease agreement with this newly unified Jewish community in Newport. And according to this agreement, Jeshuat Israel could use the synagogue in return for a nominal payment to Shearit Israel of $1 a year. And it seems that somewhere around this time, the ritual objects, such as this pair of rimonim, were returned from New York to Newport. 5 years later, a new lease agreement was signed, and this one stipulated that the Newport group must conduct worship, quote, according to the ritual rites and customs of the Orthodox Spanish and Portuguese Jews. So Shearit Israel in New York, as we said, is predominantly Sephardic. They want to carry on those traditions, such as the use of a Sephardic Siddur or prayer liturgy, and they want to see those traditions kept up in Newport as well. And the agreement also stipulates that Jeshuat Israel must have Shearit Israel's approval before hiring a rabbi. So they're concerned about the doctrines and practices of this congregation that's using Touro Synagogue. Now, it seems that in the 1910s, Shearit Israel did step in at least once to prevent alterations to the building, so they seem to be concerned with the preservation and historic character of the building. And then later in 1946, both Jeshuat Israel's leaders and trustees from Shearit Israel together signed agreements with the federal government, making Touro Synagogue a National Historic Site. Now, in the later 20th century, it seems that Jeshuat Israel paid the costs of maintaining and restoring the building, which often ran into the millions of dollars. Then in the 2000s, the ambassador John Loeb, who is a former U.S. ambassador to Denmark and who has some ancestry tracing back to the Jewish community in Newport, the ambassador paid $12 million for the grounds of the synagogue to be renovated and re-landscaped, and for a visitor center and small museum to be built. But still, at this time, Congregation Jeshuat Israel in Newport is again dwindling. There are relatively few Jews in the area who choose to practice in the Orthodox tradition. They are running out of money and worry that they cannot keep up the building and support a rabbi. In 2009, the idea is floated within Jeshuat Israel of selling off some of their assets, including historic objects. In 2010, this pair of rimonim were entrusted on a long-term loan to the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and incidentally were placed in the Keene Family Gallery, which displays 18th century American art and furniture. In 2011, the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston offered to buy the Finials for $7 million. Jeshuat Israel saw here an opportunity to create a permanent trust fund to pay for the upkeep of the building and the salary for a rabbi. And in 2012, the sale agreement between the congregation and the museum was announced. But before it could be finalized, Shearit Israel in New York objects, asserting that they are the trustees of the objects appertaining to Touro, and they will not permit the sale. And they further argue that the sale of the rimonim would violate the, quote, ritual rites and customs of the Orthodox Spanish and Portuguese Jews, as stipulated in that 1908 lease agreement. So in 2013, the Museum of Fine Arts rescinds the offer to purchase the Finials. But it does not stop there. Shearit Israel further filed suit in court to establish their ownership in law of the building and the objects. Jeshuat Israel in Newport then countersued, arguing that Shearit Israel has been uninvolved in workings or upkeep of the synagogue for about the past 100 years, and hence that they, Jeshuat Israel, should in fact be recognized as the actual owners of the building. And remember, as it's often said, possession is 9/10 of the law. So this becomes a continuing legal saga. A federal district court hears arguments off and on for 2 years, from 2013 to 15, often involving wrangling over the meanings of deeds, receipts, and account books from the 1700s and the 1820s. The presiding judge says that the case is ambiguous and there is, quote, no smoking gun. But she ultimately rules that Shearit Israel has forfeited its claim to the building and that Jeshuat Israel should be regarded as the rightful owner. In 2016, Shearit Israel appeals this decision, and a federal circuit court hears the case in 2017. And the panel of judges in this court happens to include David Souter, who had recently retired from the Supreme Court and who sometimes sat on this circuit court, evidently just for fun. And this circuit court overrules the district court, finding that the two leases from 1903 and 1908 are enough to establish that Shearit Israel is the owner and Jeshuat Israel is only the tenant of the building. In 2019, Jeshuat Israel attempts to appeal this case to the U.S. Supreme Court, but they decline to hear it. And so there the matter stands. And you might think that that is the end of the story. But evidently, in ensuing years, the leaders of the two congregations continue to butt heads, and Shearit Israel begins to demand more involvement in the running of Jeshuat Israel, including by having 2 voting members on the board of the Newport congregation. Mediation is attempted but fails. And the conflict, it seems, comes to a head when contractors install a gravestone for Ambassador John Loeb in the Newport Jewish Cemetery, which Shearit Israel had not approved of. In 2022, Shearit Israel terminates its lease agreement with Jeshuat Israel and gives Jeshuat Israel a deadline to vacate the building. And when this is not done, Shearit Israel obtains a court-issued eviction notice. And when asked by the press, the president of Shearit Israel, named Louis Solomon, says that the aim of this action is not actually to expel the congregants nor to stop Jewish worship in the building, but rather it is to overturn the board of Jeshuat Israel, which they see as uncooperative. So in theory, it seems the aim of Shearit Israel is to have the congregation in Newport reorganized and reconstituted along lines that are amenable to Shearit Israel. In 2023, Jeshuat Israel appeals the eviction order in court, and the state grants them a stay so that the eviction cannot be enforced yet while the appeal is in process. Meanwhile, in April 2023, a new Orthodox congregation is organized in Newport called Ahavas Israel, and when it is incorporated, its founding directors include 2 Newporters, as well as 3 members of Shearit Israel in New York, including the president, Louis Solomon. In August, the State Superior Court rules in favor of Shearit Israel, upholding the eviction order. And shortly after this ruling, the president of Shearit Israel, Louis Solomon, tells the press that the new congregation in Newport, Ahavat Israel, is ready to move in to replace Jeshuat Israel. And it seems from his statements that this whole dispute may stem in part from tension between seeing the building primarily as a house of worship for Jews in the local community, as opposed to as a museum and pilgrimage site. And reportedly, Louis Solomon says to reporters, quote, "With our partners at Ahavat Israel, we are committed not only to reviving the Newport Jewish community, but to reviving the place Touro Synagogue has in the hearts and minds of Jews all over America," end quote. And apparently this refers to the idea of making Touro Synagogue into more of a site for visitors. And he says, quote, "We have a great many things to accomplish for the Newport Jewish community and for Touro Synagogue. Among other things, Rabbi Myer Soloveitchik, the rabbi of Congregation Shearit Israel and acting rabbi of Congregation Ahavat Israel, will deliver special lectures there. We want to have scholars there. We want people to come up for the summers there. CJI members are welcome and encouraged to attend services at Touro Synagogue whenever they like and become members if they wish. Now is a time to heal and a time to grow." End quote. However, in October 2023, Congregation Jeshuat Israel appeals the eviction ruling to the Rhode Island Supreme Court. And this Newport group argues that Shearit Israel may technically be the owners of Touro Synagogue, but they own it only in charitable trust, not outright. Hence, in their view, decisions must further the purpose of the charitable trust, and that would mean allowing the larger, more established congregation in Newport to continue to use and maintain the building, as opposed to the new, smaller, and untested group called Ahavat Israel. Now, as far as I have been able to find, this appeal is still pending in the Rhode Island judicial system, and as of the month of August 2024, Congregation Jeshuat Israel is still in possession of the Touro Synagogue. Now, meanwhile, through all of this wrangling and back and forth, the two rimonim by Myers are still in the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, on display in the Keene Family Gallery, where they have been for 14 years now. And the credit line has been changed in the museum's records and now reads, quote, "From the Touro Synagogue, Newport, Rhode Island, collection of Congregation Shearit Israel, New York." But the finials themselves, of course, remain unchanged. And only time will tell how long they stay there and whether the use or ownership of the finials will change. The huge price that the museum once offered for them shows the enormous interest that they can attract as rare artifacts of early Jewish life and art in America. And no one as of yet, as far as I've seen, has objected to keeping them there in the MFA. But with the combination of the huge potential monetary value that they carry and the disputed control over the synagogue that they appertain to, we cannot know how long this status quo will hold. And it's remarkable that in all the reporting and commentary about the finials and this dispute over them, there has been little comment on their style or symbolism. In all of my readings, I have not seen anyone mention the pomegranate vine pattern around the central orbs of the finials, nor the number of bells on each finial, which is the symbolic number of 18. I had to observe those things myself looking at pictures on the MFA website. And this shows, I think, how the money and politics of this whole affair have overshadowed the real meaning and symbolism of the rimonim themselves, which Myers clearly wished to convey and which relate to good fortune, life, and hope. So thank you so much for listening. As regular listeners will know, this series alternates between lectures that are open to the public and those that are posted for patrons only. So please sign up to support the pod at any level, even if it's just $1, and you'll be able to hear patron-only lectures as soon as they're posted. And as I said, this lecture is brought to you by the letter W, so I'd like to thank my current active patrons whose names begin with W. Warren Green, Wiley Dickerson, Will Hughes, Will Irby, William Finn, William H., and Wilson. Thank you.